Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. I believe that one of the reasons for the deep division about Vietnam is that many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy. The American people cannot and should not be asked to support a policy which involves the overriding issues of war and peace unless they know the truth about that policy. Tonight, therefore, I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me. How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place? How has this administration changed the policy of the previous administration? What has really happened in negotiations in Paris and on the battlefront in Vietnam? What choices do we have if we are to end the war? What are the prospects for peace? Now let me begin by describing the situation I found when I was inaugurated on January 20th. The war had been going on for 4 years. 31,000 Americans had been killed in action. The training program for the South Vietnamese was beyond schedule. 540,000 Americans were in Vietnam with no plans to reduce the number. No progress had been made at the negotiations in Paris, and the United States had not put forth a comprehensive peace proposal. The war was causing deep division at home and criticism from many of our friends as well as our enemies abroad. In view of these circumstances, there were some who urged that I end the war at once by ordering the immediate withdrawal of all American forces. From a political standpoint, this would have been a popular and easy course to follow. After all, we became involved in the war while my predecessor was in office. I could blame the defeat, which would be the result of my action, on him and come out as the peacemaker. Some put it to me quite bluntly. This was the only way to avoid allowing Johnson's war to become Nixon's war. But I had a greater obligation to think only of the years of my administration and of the next election. I had to think of the effect of my decision on the next generation and on the future of peace and freedom in America and in the world. Let us all understand that the question before us is not whether some Americans are for peace and some Americans are against peace. The question at issue is not whether Johnson's war becomes Nixon's war. The great question is, how can we win America's peace? Well, let us turn now to the fundamental issue. Why and how did the United States become involved in Vietnam in the first place? 15 years ago, North Vietnam, with the logistical support of Communist China and the Soviet Union, launched a campaign to impose a communist government on South Vietnam by instigating and supporting a revolution. In response to the request of the government of South Vietnam, President Eisenhower sent economic aid and military equipment to assist the people of South Vietnam in their efforts to prevent a communist takeover. 7 years ago, President Kennedy sent 16,000 military personnel to Vietnam as combat advisors. 4 years ago, President Johnson sent American combat forces to South Vietnam. Now, many believe that President Johnson's decision to send American combat forces to South Vietnam was wrong. And many others, I among them, have been strongly critical of the way the war has been conducted. But the question facing us today is, now that we are in the war, what is the best way to end it?
The United States of America entered the Vietnam War in order to stop the spread of communism in 1969, when Richard Nixon decided he would continue American involvement. We felt that South Vietnam would fall to communism and decided that we had to intervene. Because of this, we joined forces with South Vietnam to fight the North, led by Ho Chi Minh. However, the majority of the American public was strongly against Vietnamese intervention and held many protests to express their disapproval. Nixon was very devout in winning this war for our nation and believed in Vietnamization, which was the idea that South Vietnam needed to take a greater responsibility in the war effort.
Over the past several weeks, you have heard a number of reports on TV, radio, and in your newspapers on the situation in Southeast Asia. I think the time has come for me as President and as Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces to put these reports in perspective, to lay all the pertinent facts before you, and to let you judge for yourselves as to the success or failure of our policy. When I left Washington in January of 1961, after serving 8 years as Vice President under President Eisenhower, there were no American combat forces in Vietnam. No Americans had died in combat in Vietnam. When I returned to Washington as President 8 years later, there were 540,000 American troops in Vietnam. 31,000 had died there. 300 Americans were being lost every week. And there was no comprehensive plan to end the United States' involvement in the war. I implemented a plan to train and equip the South Vietnamese to withdraw American forces and to end American involvement in the war just as soon as the South Vietnamese had developed the capacity to defend their country against communist aggression. Now on this chart on my right, you can see how our plan has succeeded. In June of 1969, I announced a withdrawal of 25,000 men. In September, 40,000. December, 50,000. April of 1970, 150,000. By the 1st of next month, May 1st, we will have brought home more than 265,000 Americans, almost half of the troops in Vietnam when I took office. Every action taken by this administration, every decision made, has accomplished what I said it would accomplish. They have reduced American involvement. They have drastically reduced our casualties. And generations in the future will look back at this difficult, trying time in America's history, and they will be proud that we demonstrated that we had the courage and the character of a great people. Thank you.
Like President Nixon said, the Vietnam War was a trying time for the United States, and Nixon sought a plan to force the South Vietnamese to fight their own war. In the years from 1969 to 1971, approximately 300 American troops were perishing every week. President Nixon created the idea of Vietnamization, which would force the South Vietnamese troops to replace American troops, thus allowing the Americans to return home. Eventually, President Nixon wrote the Nixon Doctrine, which officially declared Vietnamization in Vietnam, and was successful in the withdrawal of American forces. Nixon was profound in demonstrating his persistence in defending his countrymen and pronouncing his patriotism.
Good evening. I have requested this television time tonight to announce a major development in our efforts to build a lasting peace in the world. As I have pointed out on a number of occasions over the past 3 years, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people. That is why I have undertaken initiatives in several areas to open the door for more normal relations between our two countries. In pursuance of that goal, I sent Dr. Kissinger, my assistant for national security affairs, to Peking during his recent world tour for the purpose of having talks with Premier Zhou Enlai. The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Premier Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's assistant for national security affairs, held talks in Peking from July 9 to 11, 1971. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure. The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries and also to exchange views on questions of concern to the two sides. In anticipation of the inevitable speculation which will follow this announcement, I want to put our policy in the clearest possible context. Our action in seeking a new relationship with the People's Republic of China will not be at the expense of our old friends. It is not directed against any other nation. We seek friendly relations with all nations. Any nation can be our friend without being any other nation's enemy. I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in this spirit that I will undertake what I deeply hope will become a journey for peace. Peace not just for our generation, but for future generations on this earth we share together. Thank you, and good night.
In February 1972, President Nixon traveled to China along with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to meet with the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. Through this meeting, the Americans ended the U.S. policy of not recognizing Communist China. The U.S. also agreed to support China's admission to the United Nations and to pursue economic and cultural exchanges. China was officially recognized by the United States in 1979. Such actions also had deeper motives. They wanted to shake the Soviet confidence and make them more cautious. The main takeaway from the meeting was that Soviet progress in Asia wasn't an option. In addition, this reinforced the idea that to keep the world stable, there must be some accordance between the three world powers.
Each of us all across this great land has a stake in maintaining and improving environmental quality, clean air and clean water, the wise use of our land, the protection of wildlife and natural beauty, parks for all to enjoy. These are part of the birthright of every American. To guarantee that birthright, we must act, and act decisively. It is literally now or never. During the past 3 years, we have made a good start. We have passed new laws to protect the environment, and we have mobilized the power of public concern. But there is much yet to be done. 18 of the major environmental proposals which I put forward a year ago have still not received final action by the Congress. I repeat today my urgent request for congressional action on this much-needed legislation. And I am also presenting a number of new proposals. The environmental agenda now before the Congress includes laws to deal with water pollution, pesticide hazards, ocean dumping, excessive noise, careless land development, and many other environmental problems. These problems will not stand still for politics or for partisanship. They demand to be met now. By meeting them now, we can make 1972 the best year ever for environmental progress. The time has come for man to make his peace with nature. Let us renew our commitment. Let us redouble our effort. The quality of our life on this good land is a cause to unite all Americans.
Richard Nixon was a very devout environmentalist. He created the EPA, which was imperative to preserving the environment, especially since oil usage had gone through the roof. An executive order from Nixon called for an agency to overlook environmental protection. The EPA did phenomenal things, such as pass the Clean Air Act and set quality standards on motor vehicles to limit pollution. After Nixon's term, the environmental problem grew, and many people such as Barry Commoner stated the present course is environmental degradation. If continued, it will destroy the capabilities of the environment to support a reasonably civilized human society. Nixon's EPA was a solution to these programs. It passed 18 protections for the environment. Not only did Nixon help the American people, but he also helped the environment. That's a bonus.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. President? Yes. And so my words have not been lightly chosen. I can assure you they are deeply felt. It was almost 2 years ago, in June 1972, that 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington. It turned out that they were connected with my re-election committee, and the Watergate break-in became a major issue in the campaign. The full resources of the FBI and the Justice Department were used to investigate the incident thoroughly. I instructed my staff and campaign aides to cooperate fully with the investigation. The FBI conducted nearly 1,500 interviews. For 9 months, until March 1973, I was assured by those charged with conducting and monitoring the investigations that no one in the White House was involved. Nevertheless, for more than a year, there have been allegations and insinuations that I knew about the planning of the Watergate break-in and that I was involved in an extensive plot to cover it up. The House Judiciary Committee is now investigating these charges. On March 6, I ordered all materials that I had previously furnished to the special prosecutor turned over to the committee. These included tape recordings of 19 presidential conversations and more than 700 documents from private White House files. On April 11, the Judiciary Committee issued a subpoena for 42 additional tapes of conversations, which it contended were necessary for its investigation. I agreed to respond to that subpoena by tomorrow. In these folders that you see over here on my left are more than 1,200 pages of transcripts of private conversations I participated in between September 15, 1972 and April 27 of 1973 with my principal aides and associates with regard to Watergate. They include all the relevant portions of all of the subpoenaed conversations that were recorded. That is, all portions that relate to the question of what I knew about Watergate or the cover-up and what I did about it. They also include transcripts of other conversations which were not subpoenaed, but which had a significant bearing on the question of presidential actions with regard to Watergate. These will be delivered to the committee tomorrow. These transcripts cover hour upon hour of discussions that I held with Mr. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Dean, John Mitchell, former Attorney General Kleindienst, Assistant Attorney General Peterson, and others with regard to Watergate. They were discussions in which I was probing to find out what had happened, who was responsible, what were the various degrees of responsibilities, what were the legal culpabilities, what were the political ramifications, and what actions were necessary and appropriate on the part of the president. If read with an open and a fair mind and read together with the record of the actions I took, these transcripts will show that what I have stated from the beginning to be the truth has been the truth. That I personally had no knowledge of the break-in before it occurred. That I had no knowledge of the cover-up until I was informed of it by John Dean on March 21st. That I never offered clemency for the defendants. And that after March 21st, my actions were directed toward finding the facts and seeing that justice was done fairly and according to the law. The facts are there. The conversations are there. The record of actions is there. To anyone who reads his way through this mass of materials I have provided, it will be totally, abundantly clear that as far as the president's role with regard to Watergate is concerned, the entire story is there. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. Thank you and good evening.
Watergate was the one bad decision that overshadowed all of Nixon's good acts, making him seen by most people as a betrayer and liar to the American people. 5 burglars entered Watergate office complex, which was a hotel, and they were caught after a security guard informed the police. Nixon covered up the story and denied any knowledge of this incident. Then, in 1971, Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, which stated that the American commitment in Vietnam, despite uniformly pessimistic, was escalated by United States presidents, and they had continually lied to the public for what they were doing. Nixon sent his people to find things to insult Daniel Ellsberg. Nixon was then asked several times to release tapes, but he refused to. The people in Watergate were part of Nixon's re-election committee, CREEP. The targets were people who Nixon considered were his enemies. Watergate ended with Nixon's resignation. Here's what Nixon had to say about it.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I could say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President? Yes.
My motive was not, I didn't believe that we were covering any criminal activity. I didn't believe that John Mitchell was involved. I didn't believe that, for that matter, anybody else was. I was trying to contain him politically. And that's a very different motive from the motive of attempting to cover up criminal activities of an individual. And so there was no cover-up of any criminal activities. That was not my motive.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion. That to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation have required. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issue of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Nixon's reasons for resignation were very complex, and it involved many conspiracies and mistakes which he made. This was what brought upon the downfall of Nixon. All of this was surrounded by the Watergate scandal. He was forced to release the tapes from the recording systems, and when he released them, he was convicted on obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress.
The Nixon Doctrine was an official document comprised by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, in which President Nixon exposed his plan for Vietnamization. The Nixon Doctrine basically stated that the U.S. would continue to provide economic aid to allied nations, but their allies should not rely on American troops. In relation to the ongoing struggle in Southeast Asia, American troops would slowly be removed from Vietnam and would be replaced by South Vietnamese troops. By the end of 1971, 265,000 South Vietnamese troops would replace American forces, thus proving that the Nixon Doctrine was a success. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution designed to provide equal rights for women across the country. The Equal Rights Amendment stated, quote, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The ERA was passed by both houses of Congress, but failed to be ratified by the mandatory number of 38 states. Although this amendment was never officially ratified, the effect it had on the women's liberation movement shook the nation for years to come.
The United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, is an agency of the United States Department of Labor, established by Congress under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which President Richard M. Nixon signed into law on December 29, 1970. OSHA's mission is to assure safe and healthful working conditions for working men and women. In order to do so, it set and enforced standards by providing training, outreach, education, and assistance. The agency is also charged with enforcing a variety of whistleblower statuses and regulations. OSHA has developed a number of training, compliance, assistance, and health and safety recognition programs throughout its history. The Training Institute began in 1972. In 1978, the Susan Harwood Training Grant Program was established to train workers to establish a safer working environment. Some safety regulations made by OSHA were limits on chemical exposures, employee access to information, and mandatory use of protective equipment. In order to maintain these regulations, the agency sends out compliant safety and health officers to work sites, allowing them to perform inspections and assess fines for regulatory violations.
Urgent message. Title IX of the Higher Education Act specifically stated no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. In other words, Title IX gave women's athletics the boost it needed, and colleges across America began to support women's athletic programs more equally when compared to the men's programs.
Disappearing from the landscape.
The Endangered Species Act was signed into law by President Nixon in 1973 and advocated the protection of endangered species and to prevent the extinction of these endangered species. This act also supported the protection and conservation of the ecosystem and habitat in which the endangered species lived. Some of the species President Nixon assisted by creating the endangered species were the whooping crane, the bald eagle, the American bison, the North American cougar, the grizzly bear, the Houston toad, and the Texas blind salamander, among numerous others. President Richard Nixon put a devoted amount of effort into protecting the environment and its inhabitants, especially by signing the Endangered Species Act.
To reconcile the reality of finite resources with the needs of species and the needs of people.
Another important document passed by President Nixon was the 26th Amendment. The American public was concerned that young men who fought in wars, specifically 18 to 20 years old, could not legally vote in the election. Therefore, President Nixon and Congress passed the 26th Amendment, which stated that the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of age.